Good morning and welcome to another 5-5 at Phoenix. My name is Zoe Thompson and I am the coach here at Phoenix Life and Wellbeing Coaching. If you haven't watched any of these before, we would love you to have a look at the playlist. There's lots of episodes. I think this is episode 21 now, but the concept is pretty simple. I am joined live each week with a guest, and that guest brings with them 5 questions. 5 questions on the topic of the month. And this month, the theme is managing our emotions. So I'm joined this morning by Graham. Graham is from Maplebrook, Wales. And so he has 5 questions for me, which I'm looking forward to hearing and having the chance to answer. Before we get into the questions, Graham, do you want to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about you and the business and the work that you do?
Thank you, Zoe. Thanks for inviting me today. I am Graham Southorn from Maplebrook, Wales, and I give people peace of mind for their future and their family's future through the range of legacy planning documents and services that we offer. So we do 4 things: wills, trusts, funeral plans, and lasting powers of attorney. With wills and trusts, those are things that apply after you've passed away. They ensure that your money, your estate goes to the people you want it to go to, and maybe not the people you don't want it to go to. Funeral plans, if you've ever been at home during the day, you'll see a lot of adverts for those. They're very popular. They basically help people save money on their funeral costs. And then lasting powers of attorney, they're kind of like living wills, so they apply while you're still alive, and they allow you to delegate people who have to be over the age of 18, but those people are called attorneys, who can make decisions on your behalf if you lose mental capacity, or you just need someone to go to the bank because you're in a short hospital stay, things like that. So broadly speaking, it's documents to help people make sure that the life doesn't come unstuck while they're still alive, their family situation, and then after they've passed away, to govern where their assets go.
So important, isn't it? I think I don't know, I'd speak from my own experience. I think it's one of those conversations that nobody really wants to have, but it's a conversation that everybody needs to have, and to make sure that people around you know exactly what it is that you want and what's important to you. And I guess that's why certainly emotions being the topic is probably something that you have to manage, whether not necessarily your own emotions, but the emotions of people who you're in contact with, especially when it doesn't go to plan, or when people haven't put that plan in place, I guess.
I mean, I don't really see that so much, because I do the job for people, and after that, it's sometimes we offer probate services for people. Obviously, they're people who've done wills, so. But what I do keep a record of is the quite regular newspaper stories, media stories of people who haven't done this kind of planning, and sometimes it's gone horribly wrong, and so you can see what kind of thing might go wrong. Having said that, when I do meet people, the emotions can be strong. So I'm sure we'll put into some of that.
Yeah. So on that note, do you want to start with the first question?
Yes. So I suppose, as I said, so when I meet people to write their wills for them, there are lots of different family circumstances, and they can be very emotional. But making a will really is about making a sound decision, and a kind of sound financial decision. How do you think you can make good decisions and the right decisions when strong emotions are involved?
I think that's a great question, and I think something that comes up a lot is the difference for people between the sort of logical approach and the emotional approach, and being able to not always separate, because I think both are equally important, but looking at what both are. So looking at what your more emotional, rationalized decisions are and what the more sort of logical decisions are. I think, especially with the work that you do, quite often people are paying attention not just to their own feelings on things, but also the feelings of other people and how their decisions might impact other people. But I think it's really important for people to know what is important to them and make decisions on what's important to them, and then to communicate why that's important to other people. So I think the emotions, the logic and the emotional is both important in influencing those decisions. But I think when looking at the decision, I think it's important to look at what is the emotional influence and what's the more logical influence, and how that's impacting how you're reaching that decision. Does that make sense? Is that
yeah, I mean, quite often, I mean, I have sat in meetings where people have fallen out with their children, and they're writing a will for that reason, to give them less money or to write them out. And I'm sitting there, and I remember this one gentleman who was getting very agitated, and the longer he spoke, the higher his voice rose, and he was getting to the point where he was almost shouting, actually. And felt very angry about the way he was, from his point of view. Obviously there's always two points of view, but from his point of view, he was angry about the way one of his children had treated him, and was being very dismissive, and was wanting to write them out of the will. And I can only advise people what might happen if they do that. The kind of risk of court cases and things like that, and the ability of certainly children and a select other list of people to challenge a will if they don't like it, or if they feel they haven't been financially recompensed enough by the will, they could go to court. Whether they can afford the court fees and whether that case will be successful is another thing. But often I can advise them to do a certain type of will, which might be more expensive, or I can advise them to maybe actually give them something, just so they're not left out completely. And you'd be amazed that even though I'm giving them a logical, rational answer based on experience, sometimes the anger is so strong that they'll ignore it.
I think this is the challenge, isn't it, of not making a long-term decision based on short-term emotions. And I think sometimes people can be very quick to react, but sometimes these aren't short-term emotions. These are emotions that are attached to a long-term situation, and so they're making a decision based on that. So there's more logic attached to that. But I think it's that it's not the same scenario, but it's the same principle of sitting on that email for 24 hours before you hit the send button, isn't it?
Yeah.
And then going back and checking it and making sure that your response is proportionate, and it's a response that's going to help get the outcome that you're looking for, rather than a response that's based and influenced strongly by those emotions. So I think, with certainly in some of the situations that you're referencing there, they're quite long-term. They can be quite long-term situations, can't they? That sort of family separation or a family fallout, which needs a longer-term decision or action. But sometimes people are responding off of something that's quite short-term and that could be resolved. And sometimes the energy is better invested in trying to resolve it than taking swift action, which has got long-term consequences.
Yeah. And I should say also that sometimes it's the opposite. So I remember one client who was, near the end of her life with cancer, had a falling out with one of the children, and one of her adult children, who she felt very hard done by, and was going to sort of write him out of the will altogether. But actually during the will meeting decided to leave him several £1,000s. And then there was another gentleman who'd got divorced, but actually writing his will, he wanted to make sure that his ex-wife still benefited from his estate. So when I meet people like that, I'm actually full of kind of admiration for them, because I'm not sure I would do the same. It's forgiveness, really, an amazing amount of forgiveness. So you do encounter quite a lot of different sort of emotions. And there's also the emotion of fear, I think, as well. Fear about both good and bad fear, if that makes sense. So good fear in the sense that people sort of, they're still parents and they still want to make sure their children are being looked after, and they kind of fear for their future and they want to make sure that they're looked after. So that's kind of fear in a way that I can help with. But then there's sort of fear in a bad way that they're worried about, I don't know, one of their children getting divorced or something like that, and so they want to, because of that fear of what might happen in the future, they want to make sure they put the right planning in.
Yeah.
And the other one, sorry.
I was going to say, I think putting a will together puts you in quite a reflective mode, doesn't it? It puts you in that space of reflection. And I think where emotions come into it, that you're also, values come into it, a level of responsibility comes into it. And so there's lots of factors at play, aren't there? And I think emotions are a part of that. But I think also sometimes people's values override, or people's duty of responsibility or duty of care override those emotions sometimes. So I think it's a very interesting space for people to sit and reflect in, isn't it, of that, that legacy that they're leaving behind, what life they've led, excuse me, what life they've led, and what messages they're leaving behind, what legacy they're leaving behind.
Yeah. Yes, and I think a final one I've noted down here is pride, because sometimes people have I suppose it's the archetypal kind of will, if you imagine a will where they've got a treasured possession, and they're proud of their achievements in winning this award or whatever, medal or whatever it might be, or just something they've had in the family for a long time, and actually, rather than it just go generally into the estate and be sold or whatever, they want to give it to a particular person. And I'm trying to think of my own life. I don't think I've got any object like that, unfortunately. But it's quite special when you meet people who do. It's not that common, but sometimes you come across people like that with the treasured object, either something they've earned themselves and won, or it's something that they've happened to have acquired somehow.
Yeah, I think it's also the memories, the sentimental element that's attached to it as well, isn't it? And I know that I followed in the path of my granddad into the police service, and so when he passed, when we were looking at what his possessions, I've got the plaque that they did when he passed with his helmet badges, and I've got his helmet because it means something to me, whereas my sister had selections over other items which had more meaning for her. And so sometimes it's the meaning and the sentiment that's attached to it, as well as the pride, isn't it? And again, another range of emotions there.
Yeah, exactly.
Good first question.
Thank you. So you want number two?
Yes, please.
Number two. So I've heard a lot over the years. I've read a little bit about it, about emotional intelligence, EQ. So I was wondering, what does emotional intelligence mean to you, and how can we use it to sort of understand other people's emotions and act in an emotionally intelligent way, and kind of what does it mean in practice?
Good question. What does it mean to me? It means, there's going to be a dictionary definition, isn't there? But I think for me, it means understanding your own emotions, and understanding how your behavior can impact other people, but also being able to read and understand other people's emotions and behaviors and responses. So I know I've been very fortunate, I guess, depending on which way you want to look at it. The work that I've always done has been and has required that high amount of EQ as opposed to IQ, which is fortunate because my EQ levels are a lot higher than my IQ levels. But certainly working with people, whether that was in roles that I did with the police or whether that was roles now as a coach, is understanding and reading people's behavior, and whether that's the verbal or the non-verbal, the body language, the tone, the pace, the inflection, all come into that. So I think the number is 7% of our communication is the actual words. Everything else is the body language, tone, pace, inflection, and how we communicate. So EQ becomes really important in that. And I think especially for me, it's looking at what's not being said as much as what is being said, and being able to look at when there's a disconnect between the words that I'm hearing, but also what I'm seeing in terms of body language and responses. So that's what it means to me. There was a second part to the question, though. Can you repeat that second part for me, please?
Yeah, what does it mean in practice? You have covered some of that.
Yeah, I think it is just looking for I think for me, what's important, especially in a coaching environment, is understanding not just what people say, but what they mean by that, and checking what they want me to understand by that. So checking that I have understood them correctly. We use sort of a lot of reflection in coaching, so playing back to people what they say, and helping people to look at things from different perspectives. And so EQ, emotional intelligence, comes into that, of helping to understand not just the place they're coming from, but the emotions that come with that, and the experiences that come with that, the beliefs that come with that, all gets woven in together. So in a coaching space, it's very much, for me, and video calls are great, in person is great, phone not so much, because I'm looking at body language, I'm looking at hand movements tell a great story. So people who are very animated will quite often say one thing and their hands will say something else, or they'll struggle to find the words, but they'll show you with their hands. So they'll be trying to find a way to explain something to you, but their hands will tell you what they're trying to explain. So that's what it means for me. That's the sort of the context that I'm using it now. And is it similar for you in your work?
Yeah, well, I suppose that I've got to be mindful of the stepping on eggshells a bit, I suppose. And just sort of kind of reading the room, and I mean the way I get around it is it's quite boring, really. It's procedural. Just make sure you go ask every question. So going back to that thing earlier, people excluding people from wills, one of the questions I have to ask is, how many children do you have? And there was one meeting where I was spoken to this couple for, it must have been nearly an hour, or maybe even more than an hour, and it said that they had one daughter, and then after an hour, the lady mentioned a son, and I said, well, I thought you had one daughter. Oh, well, no, I've got a son as well. And do you have any more? Oh yeah, I've got another daughter. And I sort of turned to the husband and said, what about you? Oh yeah, well, I've got two as well from a previous marriage, but we don't talk about them. And so obviously when you talk to a will writer, this is a kind of question you've got to answer honestly, otherwise bad things can happen, both to the will writer and to yourself, if so even if there's people that you do not speak their name, it's best to mention them in a will meeting. But yeah, so obviously that was that was quite a graphic illustration, I think, of that. But as I say, I would just get around it just by asking multiple questions, just kind of being alert to what people are saying, and just maybe things that they're not saying. So maybe if people sort of shift uncomfortably and things like that, and when certain things come up, you can maybe quiz them a bit more. I don't want to sound like it's some sort of police interrogation, like you've done in the past. It's not like that at all.
It is something that needs to be sensitively managed, but they are questions that you need to ask, aren't they?
Yeah, and I struggled with this at first, and I still struggle with it a bit now. That I'm not a very extrovert person. In fact, the opposite. So asking people about, when did you get divorced, and are you planning to get married, and kind of personal questions that I would never in a million years ask someone in a pub, let's say. just sort of seems impertinent, and kind of very prying. But unfortunately, I've got to ask these things now in professional capacity. But it's amazing what people do tell you, and obviously it's all secret and wouldn't go beyond myself, but I just constantly amazed what people do say.
I think you mentioned reading the room, but I think also with the work that you do, and I think with coaching as well, you prepare the room. So the conversation, you almost preempt that there are going to be some difficult questions or quite personal questions. So it's not just reading the room, it's prepare, what I would refer to as preparing the room and saying, look, over the next hour, I'm going to need to gather information. I will ask some questions. They're not deliberately there to be uncomfortable, but they might feel uncomfortable. But the reason why I need to ask them is this, this, and this. And so you get that commitment to be the excuse me, that open and openness and honesty, but it's explaining why that's important, that you're not there just because it's it's interesting and you can go home and talk about it at the tea table of all of the interesting things you've heard today, but you are asking for a reason. There is a purpose to you asking those questions and why it's important that people are open and honest. And the same with coaching. For me to be able to support somebody on their journey, I need a true picture of what's happening and how people are feeling. So it's reading the room, but it's also preparing the room and building that rapport and that trust, building that relationship to be able to do that. And so I think there's definitely some similarities there.
Yeah. Excellent. Shall I go to question 3?
Yeah.
So obviously with wills, they're about what happens to your estate when you die, and of course when you die eventually, as we all do, your family will no doubt grieve your loss, grieve for you. And I think grief is obviously probably the most powerful emotion there is. And I wondered if you had any advice for people dealing with grief. Is there a best way to deal with it, or is everybody different, or is there anything you've learned in your experience that would help people actually when they've lost a loved one?
I agree. I think grief is very, very individual, isn't it? And I think there's the way that we respond to a loss. There's lots of influences there. There's how we've learned to respond to loss. So how your parents might have, when you're growing up and you've lost maybe a grandparent or a family member, you see how your family grieve. And I think, when you look at the differences in culture, in how different cultures grieve and celebrate or mourn the loss of a loved one, it's very different. So I think there's some learned responses in there of how we've learned to deal with grief. But I think it is very individual. And I think people look for a timeline, don't they, of when is this going to get easier and when am I going to feel better about this? And there's lots of quotes out there, aren't there, that it doesn't get any easier. The loss doesn't get any easier. You just learn to manage without that person better as time goes on. And I think that's the challenge. I think it's tough, isn't it? Because we all, most of us would say we don't want, we want people to mourn and grieve, but we don't want people to be impacted for a very long period of time. We want people to enjoy life and celebrate the life that we've had. But it doesn't always feel like that when you're the person who has experienced the loss. And so I think it is a very individual thing. And I know people come at it at different ways. I know some people have felt very guilty when they have lost somebody, and that has impacted how they've moved on with life. I think just from my own personal experience, having, from losing somebody who was very young, for me, that gave me a purpose to live life to the full, because that person's life had been taken away. And so I think people do approach it very differently. For me, on the anniversary of their death, I look at life and I think, am I living my life? Am I living my life in the best way possible? Am I living the life that I want to live? Am I doing things that are important to me? Am I living my life with purpose? And that's how I celebrate her life, because for me, from my perspective, her life was taken away very young. So she hasn't had these opportunities. So my way of reflecting on that is to make sure that I am. And that's how I approach it. But I know that other people approach that in different ways. And I know some people feel very guilty for living a life that somebody else has lost that opportunity or had that opportunity taken away. And I think it is very individual. I don't think it's for anybody to tell somebody else how they should respond to it. I don't think it's for anybody to tell people what they should be doing or how they should be doing it. I think it's that question of, how can we help you to manage this loss? How can we help you to move on when you feel ready to move on? And there's grief counselors, and there's a lot of very specific, very trained people that are able to help people with that. Not everybody needs it, but it is there for those who do. And I think it does very much depend on the circumstance and the relationship, and the age comes into it as well, doesn't it? And especially when it's unexpected and it's a young person, there's so many different dynamics that come into it. I think there's lots of models, isn't there? There's the change curve, and there's the 5 stages of grieving, and there's lots of information out there that is helpful to people. But I think ultimately that's your journey to move through a pace in a way that works for you, that's comfortable for you. And I think that's the difference, is the difficulty, isn't it, when you've got members of one family who've all experienced the same loss but are all managing it in a different way. And it's very different experiences, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I've got to admit, I don't know, I have obviously experienced it, but I don't really know much about it in terms of, I've heard of these 5 stages and things. I couldn't tell you what they were. I mean, from my perspective, when my mother had cancer, and it went on for a long time. So, it was very expected by the time she passed away. And, such an awful thing to go through, and to witness as well. But yes, I can't really, I can't really imagine the opposite side, the kind of sudden loss side. That I imagine that'd be quite a different feeling, really. But yeah, I think everybody's different, aren't they? Some people would cry, and some people would be perhaps more internal. And yeah, I don't necessarily think there is a right or wrong way, but I'm not a counsellor, and I don't know anything about it. So yeah, but definitely a strong one. I think it can affect you, a lot.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm not. I've seen the impact of loss and grief, and it's for some people it's not something that goes away, and it can have an impact on their life for a very long time. And I think it's sad to see that happen, and it's good that there are agencies and support networks out there to help people through that. But yeah, I think it's definitely very individual. There's no right, it's not a right or wrong response. I think it's just the best possible response for you and the situation that you're in.
Yeah, and I think just to mention something I've attended, called the Death Cafe, which it is not counselling. They make it very clear it's not for people who are looking to deal with grief. It's just an open discussion for a couple of hours, with tea and coffee and cakes when we were able to actually meet. And I went to one at my local place called Honors Vale, and but they're quite regular. I think they do them online as well. And it's just a general discussion about anything related to death. And some people, and everyone goes for different reasons. Some people want to go to talk about a family member or something like that. Other people are there for kind of religious or metaphysical, want to talk about that kind of thing. There's everyone goes with a different a different reason to be there, as it were, and so every discussion is different. And I find it, very very interesting. Really, it's not. There was no technical discussion about wills or estate planning. it was just a general discussion about you can talk about anything related to death at all.
And that must be very comforting for some people. I think it's I don't know that taboo would be the right word, but I think some people are uncomfortable in having those conversations, and they don't know what to say, or they don't know what's appropriate to say, or they don't know how to support family or friends when something happens. So I think, that kind of environment, and I know Arnesvel do a lot of support in that way, of having somewhere where you can go and speak openly and have that support and build a network of support as well is really helpful to have.
I would definitely recommend the death cafes, and that's exactly why they've sprung up, because of this taboo aspect. I think they are on I went to one on Zoom. I think Memorial Woodlands do them as well. I think they're free, and I think it was originally in American idea, but certainly is very popular over here, and increasingly popular with more groups springing up.
Okay.
But yeah, I think that's a good.
I'll find some information and pop some links into the chat for people who might be interested in finding out a little bit more. I think sounds a really positive option for people.
Well, I think if what it could do is it could sort of metaphorically sort of dip your toe in the water. Like if you know you're going to encounter grief at some stage, eventually a family member's going to pass away. Maybe by going to one or two of these things, it wouldn't be such a shock to the system when it does happen.
Yeah, and I think that's preparation is preparing for those conversations is sometimes part. When it's not unexpected, if there is a terminal illness, then sometimes helping get not waiting to get that help, getting that help as soon as you know that help is going to be needed, of stepping forward and getting that help is really important.
Yeah. Okay, shall we move on to number 4? So I think we talked a lot about wills and how they involve families, and we've got Christmas coming up. It's going to be extra hard this year with the social bubbles we have to observe. And so in terms of emotions, how do family relationships affect or cause our emotions? I realize it's a massive topic. Do you have, maybe to bring it down to earth, do you have any tips for surviving a family Christmas this year, and all the strong emotions that could bring out, especially with the social bubble?
Well, I think Christmas is often that cause for debate, isn't it? Of whose home should you be going to, whose turn is it, and who gets the grandchildren for Christmas Day this year, or who gets the children for Christmas this year. And I think this year's been really disruptive. I think there's been probably lots of conversations that have had to have gone on around similar. There'll be some people this year who will be experiencing their first Christmas without a loved one because they've passed away this year. I think sadly more people than perhaps would have been expected. But I think there will also be some families who are separated for the first time. So whether you're talking a relationship separation and negotiating who has children on which day, but also because of the social bubbles, there will be people who are separated who would normally spend that time together. We've been having our conversations this week about how we're going to manage it, and there will be family members who we would normally spend Christmas with who we won't see this year. Well, certainly not over the days that we would normally see them. So it's working out. I had this conversation with somebody yesterday. What can you do under the different tier options? So I think that's part of the challenge at the moment, isn't it, of not knowing what tier you might be in, which might add further restrictions. or less restrictions, but also looking at the rules and the bubble rules and what you can do and when. And so I think to help that at the moment, I think looking at what your different options are for different tiers, start to have those conversations early on, start to think about what you do want to happen and how you can manage that. And I think Christmas is the 25th, but it doesn't need to be the 25th. Christmas is about the connection. It's about spending time, quality time, and that could be done on any day. And I think that is going to be difficult for some people to get their heads around. But it's what's meaningful about Christmas for you, what's important about Christmas for you, and how can you meet that in a different way this year. And I think that's part of the challenge. I worked shift work for years, so we've, when my son was young, we did Christmas Day on whatever day I wasn't working that was near the 25th. He didn't know any different. As long as he woke up and we celebrated Christmas, it didn't matter for him. So I think there'll be some children who are not old enough to know what day of the week it is. And I think what's important is to look at what's important about Christmas for you. What is it that you really want to make happen, and then how can you make that happen over the course of the 2 weeks, with the bubbles and isolation and keeping people safe? Because ultimately, as important as Christmas is, we want to keep our loved ones safe and healthy, and it's being able to balance both of that. But I think have those conversations early on and look at the different options for the different tiers, so that you can start to work out who's potentially doing what and when, to be able to make that happen. But I think we have traditions at Christmas, but ultimately it's, what do those traditions bring? What does Christmas mean to you? What's important? Because for most people it is about seeing people and that quality time. And so that can be done on any day. So it's just working out how best to manage that, I think. But it will be difficult, and I think there will be a lot of people that feel isolated, not in terms of isolation, but will feel isolated from family and friends in a way that they haven't experienced before, and that's going to be challenging. But I hopefully there will be lots of options for people online. I know Sarah Millican, the comedian, she does a is it join in that she does on Twitter. So for people who are on their own for Christmas, or who don't celebrate Christmas for whatever reason, can join in with a fun supportive community online on Christmas Day, New Year's Day, if they want that support. So hopefully there will be lots online that will offer extra support for people. It's going to be tough.
I mean, we're looking for a silver lining in all of this. I mean, because you've got to make quite harsh decisions about who you're going to see and things like that. For some people it may take the pressure off them a little bit. The sort of people who feel very pressured to for example, cook a large meal and everything's got to go perfectly, and they don't leave anyone out, and they've got to have everyone there together. And because of the rules being so I'm going to say clear. I don't think the rules are clear, but you know what I mean. They're because they're so definite. You can only see these 3 people, etc. Maybe Christmas will be smaller for some people, and for a small proportion of people, maybe that would be a good thing, because they don't have to. It'll take a bit of the weight off their shoulders, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I think there will be benefits for some people, and I think others will find it quite difficult. But I think that mirrors the entire year, really, doesn't it? There's been lots of positives for people, and there's also been lots of changes that haven't been comfortable or haven't felt in our control. And I think it's the same. Again. I think it's taking that step back and recognizing and acknowledging that this is not forever. This is something that we need to do until this is under control, and that's not forever. So it's one Christmas, one period of time, and then we have to make the best of the situation that we're in, that we can celebrate. other families in different religions have had to work around their festivals and their celebrations over the last couple of months. So it's doing the best you can with what we can, and know that this isn't permanent, and there will be next year where we can do things differently. So,
and top tip for avoiding Christmas arguments:
don't drink too much.
Yeah, that's a good one.
And remove yourself, walk away find a different room and a different conversation if you're starting to feel tensions rising. I think walk away. And if you know that you're in an environment that's susceptible to lots of emotions and potential arguments of, not having too much alcohol, and maybe just creating that space that you can go into a different room or speak to a different member of the family, or keep your visiting time short and sweet.
Well, that's it. I follow the mantra of the old acting sort of expression of leave people wanting more. So the times when I spent a long time with family members have been good times, but the longer you're in someone else's space, I think that the more likely it is, let's say, for tensions to arise.
Yeah, especially if you don't normally spend a lot of time with them. It's you go from 0 to 60 quite quickly, don't you? And if you're in somebody else's space, or you've got people in your space, so especially introverts who like their own space and who like smaller groups and time out, it's making sure that you kind of plan that in. If you've got one day of very what I would call people intense day, of making sure that the day after that is a people clear day, and just taking balancing it out of not having lots of days with lots of people, which I don't think we will have because of the rules, but making sure that you've got that space to step away into and balancing it out.
Yeah. Okay. Shall I move on to the last one?
Yeah, last question.
Hopefully this is quite a fun one. I'm going to ask you the question, then I'm going to explain it. So,
okay.
Are there any emotions that you find hard to articulate? So I'll explain the question. I did a bit of preparation for this, Zoe, believe it or not, and I watched some TED Talks about emotions, and there was one by Tiffany Watt-Smith, and she's a historian. She studied the history of emotions, and she's gone through the literature of history, science, art, music to come up with descriptions of emotions that you might not otherwise pinpoint. So I'll give you some examples. Ilinx is an urge to do something reckless or mischievous. Torschluss panic is a German word for gate closing panic, and that's the feeling you get when life's running out on you, or life's passing you by. Malu, a sudden experience of feeling constricted, inferior, or awkward around people of higher status. So that might be when you're trapped in the lift with the boss, or you meet a celebrity, for example. This happens to me.
Yeah.
I can't even say it. Kaipu. And this is a good one. This is an unshakable longing for a place you've never been. So homesickness for a place you've never seen, you've never actually been to. And then a good one for Christmas, Awumbuk. That's an air of loneliness or emptiness after visitors depart. So I suppose I've got one. I'll tell you my one. And it's a kind of I don't know what words put to it. You can suggest the word, but mine is regret for concerts that I never went to. So, for example, I'm a huge fan of a rock band called Grateful Dead, and there's not many days go by when I don't listen to some Grateful Dead. Huge influence on my life. When I was a student, they played at Wembley Arena, and I had labs the next day at my course, and I didn't go, and I constantly regret it ever since, and it's stupid, I know. And there's a couple of other, maybe one other concert I massively regret going to. So it's a kind of regret, but yeah, that's my example. Well, the other one is when my wife has the last Quality Street chocolate of the kind that I actually like. So there's only then a coconut left or something.
Oh, that's a great one. What a great question. I
Long
don't, I'm trying
question.
to think what comes to mind. So and for anyone who knows me quite well will know that I tend to take action and then regret rather than not take action and regret. Although I'm not big on regret. I think everything happens for a reason. But I think if I was more, I would be more likely to regret not doing something than doing it, which is why I tend to do much more than I ever plan. I tend to say yes and then think about it later. What emotions? Such an interesting question. I interestingly, and it doesn't answer the question, I fully accept this doesn't answer the question, but I work quite a lot with metaphors and analogies. So sometimes it can be really difficult for people to communicate how they feel, but they can't find the words for it. But what they'll do is they'll describe it. So somebody recently described it. They said it's like a typhoon, and it feels like everything is spinning around in my head, and everything's getting dragged into it that isn't relevant. So we can then work with that analogy. And sometimes I've worked with clients where I don't even know what it is I know what the metaphor that they're describing or the analogy that they're giving me, but I don't know what's going on behind it. So it can be really useful for trauma, PTSD type conversations, because it means people don't have to relive the experience or talk about the emotions, but they can talk about an image or a metaphor, and we can work with that. So that's really helpful, and it's work I really enjoy doing. And I work with, I quite often will use descriptions when I can't find the words. So I think that's doesn't answer the question, but I'm trying to think.
Well, I think what you're saying is basically that you're agreeing, I think, with Tiffany Watt Smith, that there are more emotions besides kind of fear, love, all the kind of main ones. There's other things where you've got maybe a feeling or a mood, and it's sort of hard to articulate it.
Yeah, and another piece of work that I have done and that does come up is that people tend to use the same descriptions for how they feel. So people will tend to use the same words to describe a feeling, but when you ask more questions, it's not that feeling, it's something else. So people will talk about fear, but it might not be fear, it might actually be some excitement, but with a little bit of trepidation attached to it. So when you look at, and it's such a great question, this, because when you look at emotions, there are hundreds and thousands of words that describe how we feel, but most people in their vocabulary probably use 5 to 10, and that they will reference certain emotions, and they will use that as an umbrella for how they feel. So when you look at people who really struggle with anxiety, they will quite often umbrella how they feel under that anxiety umbrella. But sometimes it's not anxiety, it's something else, but they recognize the feeling, and so it gets pigeonholed quite quickly. So helping people to broaden their use of different words to describe their emotions can be really helpful in unlocking patterns of thought, patterns of behavior, patterns of feeling. So it's a really interesting question. I would not describe myself as a words person. Some people have a really wide vocabulary, don't they? They like to learn new words, and they like to explore using new words in conversations. It's not something I've ever really done. And in fact, quite often I'll be reading materials and I'll need to look up the meanings of words to do that. So it's a great question, because I would tend to describe the feeling rather than attach a word to it. But I'm still trying to think of feelings that.
But someone barges in ahead of you in a queue or something like that.
I think the thing that's coming to my mind is that piece of how do you describe it, of that absolute silence. And I think there's something about first thing in the morning. So I don't describe myself as a morning person, but I wake up quite early. But I like to sit with coffee and just listen and just sit with that absolute silence. You know, there's no traffic, there's occasionally the odd bird you hear, but it's that complete silence. And I don't know how you would, maybe that's it, of
That's
how
interesting.
that
Yeah.
feels. And if I have a morning where I can't do that, that's the feeling I can't describe. It's almost that frustration that I've been robbed of my
Ah.
little silence
Yeah.
in the morning.
Oh, that's
I don't
very.
know. It's why I don't do networking at 7 o'clock, because I like I like to sit with, I like to start my days slow, but I think that's what I always have trouble describing. I'm having trouble describing it now, of how to explain what that feels like and why that's important.
Mm.
Great question.
Thank you. Yes,
I would like to watch that TED talk actually. If you can pop me the link, I'd be really
I
interested.
will. And there's another fascinating one that I think everybody should watch, actually, by a psychology professor, Lisa Feldman Barrett. And she describes how she's scanned people's brains, scanned people's facial expression, and analysed a lot of other studies. And what she's found is that emotions are, scientifically speaking, they are actually predictions of they're your brain's predictions of what happens when you feel something, like if you feel your stomach churn or your heart beat faster or something like that, then your brain sort of interprets what that might mean, and
Mm.
and then constructs the emotion around it, which means it gives us hope actually for better managing our emotions. As you said, it's not a quick fix, but once you understand how an emotion is caused,
Yeah.
you can perhaps do something about it.
And I'm sure I've read somewhere that we feel the response before we acknowledge cognitively. So somatically, we feel a response. Our body picks up on that before our brains work out what it is, which ties in with what you're saying. Right? The
Yeah.
analogy that I use working with people is that it's your emotions are your engine light. So when you feel the emotions, it's telling you to look deeper into something. So it's asking you
Yeah.
to acknowledge that something is going on. And like with anybody who's ignored the warning light in their car knows that if you ignore it and you switch it off and hope that it will go away, it will just reappear in something else that forces you to take notice. So emotions are like a warning light, like a warning signal of, not necessarily in a negative way, but it's getting your attention that there is something for you to pay attention to.
But it could be an erroneous prediction by your brain. So, like in my case, I think I failed. I can't remember how many times I failed, but I failed. I failed my driving test like 4 or 5 times, and not being able to sleep the night before, and heart pumping away, and my brain was thinking, "Oh my God, it's that test tomorrow, and you didn't look in the mirror last time," and all that kind of thing. And I think from watching her talk, maybe you could reframe that in your mind as being, it's not as simple as this, obviously, but I'm going to smash it tomorrow, or
Yeah.
I can drive around without making these mistakes. And as she says in the talk, this is going to take practice. It's not an easy fix, but just knowing the fact that you can kind of retrain your brain to recognize what's happening to you,
Yeah.
and not have that instant thing of, oh my God, it's a driving test, I'm going to fail, which happens to me so many times. Then maybe that's some hope for us all, I think.
Yeah. It sounds like a very useful talk for people who are looking to break patterns of thoughts. Because it's that again, that umbrella of, it feels like this, so it must be this.
Exactly.
And
Yes.
disconnecting the links that are not helpful anymore, and reconnecting what it could be, and thinking of it, excuse me, responding to it in a way that is more helpful to us now. So really interesting. Yeah, if you can send links to those talks, that'd be great, and we'll pop them in the chat as well. And we'll also pop in the details of where people can find you and connect with you if they want to find out a little bit more, or perhaps this has nudged them a little bit in some actions that they might need to take to get themselves prepared for things in the future. But thank you so much for your time and such excellent questions. I feel like I've done a lot of thinking today.
Thank you very much.
Provoking questions. Thank you.
Yeah, great answers. Thank you.
Brilliant. Right. Well, thank you very much for, I do really appreciate your time and coming on. For those of you who are watching live, feel free to ask any questions. If you're watching this back on any of the social media channels, you can pop any questions or comments that you have into the comments box on the channel that you're watching. I will keep my eye out for any notifications and respond to you. You can please do feel free to connect with us across the channels. There will be the website details for both myself and Graham will get linked in. But thank you very much for your time in watching. Thank you, Graham, once again for your time and excellent questions. And we will be back again soon with another guest, another 5 questions and another topic. Thank you very much.
Bye.